The content in this video is based on factual, real-life events and public records. All opinions expressed are for educational and documentary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised, as some scenes may depict sensitive content. This video is intended for informative purposes and complies with YouTube's guidelines. The alarms had already been screaming for 3 minutes, but inside Folsom's upper-tier corridor, everything felt strangely still. Even the guards froze as the figure stepped out of the smoke, tall, covered in soot, a faded skull tattoo running up his neck like it was carved there. His name was Mason Harlow, the inmate California wished the world would forget. His eyes were cold, unreadable, and behind him, the iron door of cell 47 hung off its hinges like someone had ripped it open with nothing but anger and time. The officer closest to him whispered, "How did he break out of solitary? That door is steel." But Mason didn't say a word. He just lifted his hands slowly, palms open, showing the black ink that covered them, sigils, numbers, symbols no one ever fully understood. And then, without warning, he glanced upward toward the control room window, as if he were staring straight into the future, seeing a disaster that no one else saw coming. At that exact moment, the entire row of cells erupted. Voices, shouts, metal crashes, like something had been triggered far beyond Mason himself. It wasn't a riot. It was something colder, something organized, something California had tried, for decades, to bury under paperwork and sealed archives. Because Mason Harlow was only number 7 on the list. 9 more names, 9 more stories, 9 more inmates California wished the world would forget. And as the alarms blared across the prison yard, one question hung in the air like smoke. If Mason wasn't the most dangerous, then who was? If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. Long before the alarms screamed through Folsom that morning, the story began in a quieter moment, though nothing inside that prison ever truly felt calm. A thin layer of fog clung to the hills around Folsom, the kind that made the razor wire look like it floated between earth and sky. Guards walked their usual routes, checking gates, counting heads, doing what they always did. The inmates moved with routine, some heading to the yard, others to the shop, others simply pacing their cells. No one expected the day to become the kind people whispered about years later. In one of the lower blocks sat the man who would become the spark, the reason every hidden file and forgotten report burst back into the light. Derek "Bluehand" Lawson, a heavy-set man with swirling blue tattoos running from his wrists to his shoulders. His tattoos weren't just art. They were messages, stories of a past no one could fully decode. He sat on his bunk staring at the tiny window, tapping his fingers in a slow rhythm. Other inmates said he tapped that rhythm before something happened, like thunder before rain. That morning, Mason Harlow, still locked in solitary, sat on his cement bench tracing the faded skull tattoo on his arm. His cell was supposed to be the safest place in the entire prison, the room built for men no one else wanted to breathe the same air with. Yet somehow, the security cameras caught something odd around 6:17 a.m. Mason wasn't sleeping. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't eating. He was sitting perfectly still, staring straight at the door as if waiting for a signal. The guards didn't notice it yet. They also didn't notice that on the other side of the prison, inmate number 5 on the list, Calvin Red, was quietly talking to 3 cellmates through the vent system. Calvin had a burning sun tattoo on the back of his hand, something he covered with a bandage whenever guards walked by. No one ever figured out why he hid it, or why the symbol made other inmates go silent when they saw it. By 6:40 a.m., small things began to shift. A mop bucket left near a maintenance door. A guard delayed by a routine call. A keyring dropped and picked up too quickly. Things that looked normal, but didn't feel normal. At 6:55 a.m., everything snapped. It started with a low thud deep inside the east corridor, followed by a light flicker. Maybe a fuse blew, maybe something else. Folsom's report never fully explained it. But that flicker was enough to disrupt the lock on cell 47 for exactly 3 seconds. Just 3. And that was all Mason needed. The moment his door clicked, he moved with a speed people later described as unnatural, but really, it was years of confinement turned into raw determination. He shoved the door once, twice, On the third hit, the weakened lock snapped free. Guards rushed in, but something was off. Mason didn't attack. He didn't run. He just stood there, calm, almost eerily calm, looking past the guards toward the upper tier like he already knew what was about to unfold. The panic hadn't begun yet. That came 30 seconds later. Down in the lower block, Derek, Bluehand, Lawson suddenly stopped tapping his fingers. He stood up, cracked his knuckles, and stepped toward the bars. Other inmates watched him with suspicion, then with fear. No one said a word when they saw the expression on his face, like he understood something the rest of the world didn't. By the time the alarms finally activated, two things had already happened. Bluehand had vanished from sight, and the control room received a silent alert, one that didn't match any modern Folsom system. It was an alert from the 1970s, from a part of the prison that hadn't been used in decades. A guard muttered, "That's impossible, that wing was sealed." Inside the rising chaos, a young correctional officer named Reeves ran down the stairs, radio shaking in his hand. He shouted to the others, but no one heard him the first time. When he repeated himself, his voice cracked. "It's not just Mason. There are 9 others. Their names are flagged red. They're all linked." The hallway went silent, not because they understood, but because they didn't. Before Officer Reeves could finish explaining, the lights above him flickered again. The air carried a heavy rumble, the kind that makes people step back without knowing why. Something was building. Something bigger than an escape. Bigger than a riot. Bigger than any single inmate. And it all centered around the 10 men California had tried for decades to erase from memory. The moment the second alarm triggered, the old one, the one from the sealed wing, the entire prison froze. Then one question spread through every guard, every inmate, every trembling breath in that echoing hallway. If the sealed wing was waking up, what exactly had they locked inside it? The second alarm, the ancient one from the sealed wing, echoed through Folsom with a strange metallic hum, different from anything the newer guards had ever heard. It didn't just ring. It vibrated through the concrete floors like the sound traveled through the bones of the building itself. The older officers looked around with dread because they recognized the sound. The younger ones stared, confused, waiting for someone to say it was just a malfunction. But no one said anything. Officer Reeves stood at the base of the stairwell, clutching the radio to his chest. His breathing was sharp and uneven as he watched the lights flicker again. Something inside him kept whispering that the sealed wing shouldn't be waking up. That place was locked down long before he was even born. It was where they kept the inmates the state never wanted to talk about. The ones people whispered about in courtrooms and hallways. The ones whose files were buried in boxes with "Do Not Release" stamped across them. Up in the corridor where Mason Harlow stood, the air grew heavy, like the whole block was holding its breath. Mason didn't move. He didn't look scared, angry, or confused. He looked like someone waiting for a train he already knew would arrive late. His skull tattoo glistened under the shaky fluorescent light, and his eyes carried a strange emptiness, like this moment was only the beginning of something much larger. A voice from the upper rail called down to him. "Mason, hey, what did you do?" Mason didn't answer. He turned his head slightly, as if listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. Down below, another guard stumbled in, sweat lining his forehead. He barked into his radio, asking for backup, asking for answers, asking for anything that could explain why a sealed wing from over 40 years ago had just signaled a breach. But the only reply he got was static. In cell block B, inmates were pressed against their bars, trying to figure out what was happening. Calvin Red, with the bandage tattoo on his hand, moved back from the vent he'd been whispering through. His cellmates stared at him with wide eyes. "You said nothing was going to happen today." Calvin lowered his bandaged hand and whispered back, "It wasn't supposed to happen today." Something in his voice didn't sound panicked, only irritated, like someone changed a plan without telling him. In the far west hallway, 3 guards rushed toward the sealed wing entrance, a thick steel door with rust creeping through old bolt holes. The door was welded shut decades ago and reinforced again in 2003 for historical preservation, at least according to the public records. But the guards saw the truth. The welds weren't as solid as the reports claimed. Faint cracks ran along the edges, like something inside had been pushing against it for years. One guard whispered, "We need reinforcement before anyone goes near that door." But the decision was too late. Before they stepped back, A cold rush of air pushed through the cracks, carrying a scent none of them recognized. Not smoke, not chemicals. Something old, something stale, something that didn't belong in a living place. Back in the main hallway, Officer Reeves tried to steady himself. He finally found a channel on his radio that wasn't fried with static. A faint voice came through, asking for a status update. Reeves pressed the button, swallowing hard. We have a breach, possibly multiple. The sealed wing alarm activated. The old files flagged 10 inmates connected to. The radio cut out again. He felt the weight of 10 unspoken names pressing against him, but he only knew 2, Mason Harlow and Derek Bluehand Lawson. The other 8 were locked inside records he didn't have clearance to open. Suddenly, a loud metallic clang tore through the hallway, the unmistakable sound of something slamming against metal. Everyone turned toward Mason's end of the block. He stepped forward slowly, still calm, still controlled. A guard pointed at him, shouting, "Stay where you are." Mason paused, then looked up toward the higher tiers again. The whole block shook lightly. Dust drifted down from the ceiling like powdered snow. 5 seconds later, the first old lock snapped. A ripple of panic spread down the corridor as inmates shouted in confusion and fear. Doors that had nothing to do with Mason or Bluehand or anyone else suddenly shook in their frames. Not opening, but reacting, like the vibrations came from deep inside the building. Reeves whispered to himself, "It's spreading." He didn't know what it was. No one did. But something was moving through the infrastructure, through vents, through old wiring, something from the sealed wing. Inside cell 12, a thin tattooed man named Carter Pike sat up sharply. He had a barbed wire tattoo around his neck, the ink faded from age. He hadn't spoken to another inmate in 6 months, but now he whispered 2 words to himself. They woke them. In another block, a tall inmate covered in maze-like tattoos across his arms and chest stood and smirked as the lights flickered again, like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. Upstairs, the guards were losing control of the situation fast. Radios kept failing. Backup wasn't arriving. And the sealed wing door, it let out a long metallic groan. Reeves took a step toward the main stairwell. He needed answers. He needed a way to make sense of why Mason Harlow, locked away for years, had walked out of solitary with the look of a man following a schedule. But then a voice from behind him spoke. "You're not supposed to be down here, kid." Reeves spun around. It was Warden Hale himself, a tall, gray-haired man with a stern face and a tattoo of 2 crossed arrows hidden beneath his sleeve, one he got before his career started. His boots echoed softly on the concrete as he approached. Reeves stammered, "Sir, the sealed wing, the alarms, it's all." "I know," the warden cut in. "And that's the problem." Reeves blinked at him. "Why would a dormant wing still have a live alarm system? Why wasn't any of this in my training manual?" Warden Hale stared toward the thick steel door at the end of the west hallway, jaw tense. "Because we were never supposed to talk about them," he said quietly. "The 10. Reeves swallowed. 10 inmates. 12 originally," Hale murmured. "Only 10 survived." Reeves felt his skin go cold. Survived what? Hale didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the balcony rail and stared down at Mason Harlow, who was still standing calmly in the shifting lights. The warden's voice dropped to a whisper, "And we only needed one of them awake for the rest to follow." Reeves stepped back, feeling the words settle like wet cement in his chest. The sealed wing alarm blared again, louder this time. Then another lock inside the prison failed. This time, it wasn't a flicker. It was a full release, the kind that sent every guard reaching for backup buttons. Reeves looked up sharply. "What does that mean? What just opened?" The warden closed his eyes for a second, as if saying the truth out loud might make it real. "It means," he said quietly, "someone in that sealed wing is now loose." Before Reeves could respond, a long crack echoed down the corridor, a slow, dragging sound like metal being pulled apart from the inside. Every inmate went silent. Every guard froze. Even Mason finally reacted. For the first time since he stepped out of solitary, he lifted his head fully, eyes widening ever so slightly. Then, deep behind the sealed door, something hit it from the other side. Once, twice, 3 times, and the final hit ripped a bolt clean out of the steel. Reeves felt every hair on his arms rise. Something was coming out, and it wasn't Mason. The bolt that ripped free from the sealed wing door clattered across the concrete floor, spinning in slow circles before settling. The sound echoed through the prison like a warning no one wanted to hear. Reeves tightened his grip on the railing, his chest rising fast as the warden stepped forward with the sort of calm a person used when panic was no longer an option. Every inmate went completely quiet. Even the ones who usually shouted at guards, bragged about old stories, or fought over tiny things fell silent. It was the kind of quiet that only happened when fear leveled everyone: officers, inmates, and anyone unlucky enough to be inside Folsom's walls. Another groan dragged through the wing as the door bent inward ever so slightly. Reeves felt his breath catch. Someone's pushing it. The warden didn't answer. His eyes didn't leave the metal door. The tattoo under his sleeve, those two crossed arrows, pulsed against the fabric as his arm tensed. From the lower tiers, Mason Harlow finally shifted. For the first time since he stepped out of solitary, he took a slow step toward the direction of the door, almost like he was drawn by something familiar. His boots scraped lightly against the ground, quiet enough that only a few inmates noticed. One of them, a thin man named Carter Pike, whispered just loud enough for the nearest prisoners to hear, "If he's awake." Then another one is too. Reeves felt the weight of those words, even though he didn't know what they meant. He turned to the warden. "Sir, what were they?" "Those 12 inmates." Warden Hale didn't blink. His jaw tightened before he finally answered. "They weren't the worst because of what they did. They were the worst because they had nothing left to lose." Reeves swallowed hard. He could feel the air tightening around him, as if the walls were closing in just a little. Down below, Officer Kemp rushed in from the east block, out of breath. "Warden, we have movement in C Wing. Doors are rattling like the systems are cross-triggering." Hale shot him a sharp look. "Cross-triggering is impossible unless—" Kemp cut him off. "Unless something is overriding the system. Something old. Something pre-digital." Reeves felt his skin crawl. How can an old system override the new one? They're not even connected. Hale didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked toward the seized wing door, stopping a few feet away. He studied the cracks in the welds like a doctor examining an injury. After a long pause, he finally said, "Because the sealed wing wasn't shut down the way the state claimed. It was only buried beneath newer systems." Reeves blinked. "But why? Why keep anything alive in there?" Hale kept staring at the door. "Because they didn't want to risk the world seeing them again." A long metallic creak rolled through the hallway. The sealed door bent inward further. Only an inch, but enough for air from the inside to rush out in a cold wave that brushed against Reeves' face and arms. It felt like opening a freezer door, except this chill carried something older, heavier. Behind him, inmate Calvin Red peeled back the bandage covering his tattoo. The burning sun symbol on his hand shimmered faintly under the flickering lights. His cellmate hissed, "Cover it. You know what that means if they see it." Calvin didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the sealed wing. "They're not seeing me," he said quietly. "They're waking him." Up on the second tier, Mason Harlow slowly reached the railing. He placed both tattooed hands on the metal bar and stared straight at the door as if he were looking through it, seeing something the others couldn't. When the next bolt fell, the sound made everyone flinch except him. Reeves leaned closer to the warden. "Mason knows who's behind that door." "Of course he does," Hale replied softly. "He spent 5 years in the sealed wing before they moved him out." Reeves felt his stomach drop. 5 years? How is that not in his file? "Because the real file," Hale said, "is not the one you've seen." Lightning flickered across the narrow sky visible through the barred window at the top of the block, casting thin shadows across the concrete. The hum of lights, the whispers from cells, the tension in every guard's stance. The whole prison felt like it was bracing for impact. Reeves tried to steady his voice. What exactly was the sealed wing for? The warden exhaled slowly. It was created during a time when California faced inmates who couldn't be housed with the general population, not because of violence, but because of influence. Reeves frowned. Influence. They had the ability to move people without touching them. Not physically, socially, psychologically. He nodded toward Mason. Men who could trigger unrest with a sentence. Men who could unite enemies with a single look. Men who turned a prison block into a quiet battlefield. Reeves shook his head. "But that's just manipulation. Why call them the 10? Because manipulation wasn't the problem." The warden lowered his voice. "The problem was what they did when they were together." Another deafening impact struck the sealed door, harder than before. The hinges snapped a little. Dust rained from the ceiling. Inmates backed away from their bars. Guards stepped further from the hallway. Even Mason's expression changed, just slightly, like someone bracing for an old memory to walk back into the room. Reeves whispered, "Who's behind that door?" The warden turned his head just enough for Reeves to see the worry in his eyes. Number 1. Reeves felt his heart pound. Number 1 of the 10? The worst of them. Hale nodded once. The state reported he died in 1983. They lied. The lights flickered again, this time going out for a full 2 seconds before blinking back to life. In that brief darkness, something moved behind the sealed wing door. A shadow. Slow, steady, tall. Reeves stumbled back. He's right there. He's standing right behind it. The warden didn't speak. The inmates didn't breathe. Even Mason stopped moving. Then, the sealed wing door gave a long, metallic screech and slid open 3 full inches. Cold air poured out like steam from a broken pipe. Reeves stared at the gap, feeling every part of him tighten. "Sir, do we call for evacuation? Reinforcements? Something?" Hale finally looked at him, expression carved from stone. "Reeves, you need to understand something. If number 1 steps out of that wing, there is no evacuation. There is no reinforcement. There is only containment." Reeves swallowed. How? How do we contain someone like that? The warden didn't answer. He couldn't, because at that exact moment, a pale hand, thin, tattooed with symbols Reeves didn't recognize, slid quietly through the 3-inch gap, fingers wrapping around the edge of the door. Every inmate who saw it stepped back, even the ones who had nothing to do with the 10. Reeves felt his legs weaken. The warden whispered a name Reeves had never heard, but Mason Harlow reacted instantly, straightening his back like a soldier hearing a commander's call. The hand tightened on the steel. The door groaned again. And then, with one slow, steady pull, the sealed wing door began to open. Not forced, not kicked, not broken. Opened. As if the person on the other side had been waiting decades for a guard, an inmate, anyone, to stand right where Reeves stood now. Reeves took 1 step back, and a voice drifted through the opening, calm, old, quiet. "Is Mason awake?" Reeves' heart stopped. Mason's head lifted sharply. The warden's face went pale. The old wing wasn't waking up. Someone inside it was calling for Mason Harlow. The voice coming from the 3-inch opening of the sealed wing door didn't sound like it belonged to someone who had spent decades in darkness. It wasn't cracked or desperate. It was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that made the entire block feel colder. Reeves stepped back instinctively, but the warden put a hand on his arm, holding him in place, even though Reeves could feel Hale's fingers trembling slightly through his sleeve. The warden stared at the gap in the door with a look that suggested he'd spent years praying this day would never come. The pale tattooed hand still held the edge of the steel door. Another inch of movement made the metal groan softly, like it was protesting after decades of silence. Down below, Mason Harlow finally moved fully into the center of the block. The skull tattoo under his eye seemed darker in the flickering light. His arms, covered in ink patterns and quiet markings, hung loose at his sides. He didn't look scared. He didn't look angry. He looked resigned, like someone walking toward a truth he'd spent years avoiding. Across the tier, Calvin Red whispered tightly to the other prisoners who were pressed close to their bars. His bandaged tattoo shimmered again under the lights. "If number 1 is alive, none of us stay where we are. He doesn't settle. He pulls everyone in." Carter Pike shook his head, his barbed wire tattoo tightening over his neck as the muscles beneath it tensed. "You knew this was coming." Calvin didn't answer. Another soft scrape echoed from the sealed door. Reeves felt his heartbeat pounding in his temples. "Sir, who is that voice? Who is number 1 to Mason?" The warden didn't take his eyes off the opening. "He's the only person Mason ever feared." Reeves blinked hard. "Mason? But Mason has never." "Yes," Hale said quietly. "I know." Mason stopped walking right at the lower rail, directly under the stairwell where Reeves stood. He lifted his gaze slowly toward the gap in the sealed wing door. His breathing seemed to stop. Then the voice came again. "Good," it said softly. "Bring him here." Every inmate stepped back from their bars. Reeves felt the air tighten around him like invisible fingers were wrapping around his throat. "Bring him?" "Mason doesn't take orders. He does from number 1. Hale said, voice low. Every member of the 10 did. Number 1 didn't lead with fear. He led with something worse. Reeves swallowed. "What?" "Belief." Before Reeves could ask more, A tremor rolled through the block. The sealed wing door shook violently. Once, then twice, before the pale hand pulled back inside. The gap widened to 4 inches. Reeves grabbed the railing, steadying himself. He's opening it from the inside. Hale nodded slowly. He's letting himself out. And that's what makes this dangerous. A deep silence fell over the entire block, the kind that made even the hum of lights sound too loud. Mason took 2 slow steps forward, each one echoing through the concrete. His expression shifted, not into fear, but something more complicated. Memory, recognition, submission. Reeves whispered, "Sir, should we stop him?" "How?" the warden asked softly. "If we move, the entire block reacts. If the block reacts, the system reacts. If the system reacts." The lights went out. Not a flicker, not a pulse. Complete darkness. A single alarm hummed somewhere above, but it sounded far away, muffled under layers of concrete and metal. In the pitch-black silence, only one sound filled the prison. A slow exhale from inside the sealed wing. Reeves felt his breath freeze in his throat. Then footsteps. One step. Another. Soft, steady, controlled. The kind of footsteps that carried certainty, not hesitation. Emergency lights finally clicked on, casting the entire block in red. In that dim glow, Reeves saw Mason standing perfectly still. He also saw the sealed wing door, now pushed open wide enough for a person to slip through. But no one slipped out. Instead, a figure stood just barely inside the darkness. Not visible, not clear, just a tall shape with deliberate posture. The tattoos on the hand that pulled the door glinted again. Symbols Reeves didn't recognize, curling down the fingers like quiet instructions carved into skin. Reeves whispered, "Why doesn't he step through?" "He's not coming out," the warden murmured. "Not yet." "Then what is he doing?" "Waiting." "For what?" "For Mason." Reeves felt a shiver run along his spine. He didn't know why, but the answer felt wrong in every possible way. The warden took a breath, steadying his voice. "Number 1 never takes the first step. He waits for others to prove they'll follow." Hale shouted down into the block, "Mason, stay where you are." But Mason didn't move. He didn't step forward. He didn't step back. He just stood there, chest rising slowly, silently calculating. Inmates began whispering frantically across the tiers. "Is that really him? He's supposed to be dead. They kept him down there. No way they let that man live. What does he want with Mason?" The emergency lights brightened just enough for Reeves to see Mason tilt his head slightly, as if listening to a memory rather than a person. Reeves looked down at him. "Mason, don't go." But Mason didn't even glance upward. Calvin Red peeled the bandage fully off his hand, revealing the tattoo. It wasn't just a sun. It was a circle with lines radiating outward, 10 lines. But one of them was thicker than the rest. "Number 1, Calvin whispered. "If he calls, Mason moves." That's how it always worked. Panic rippled across the cells. The figure in the doorway shifted. Just a small motion, but enough for the tattoos to catch the red light again. Reeves gripped the railing tighter. "Why him? Why Mason? What does number 1 want?" Hale exhaled sharply. "He wants the 10 reunited." Reeves's voice broke. "You mean the others? Calvin? Carter? Blue Hand? Are they part of it?" "Some," Hale answered. "Not all, but enough." Reeves felt the weight of the block pressing in on him. The system wasn't reacting because of a malfunction. It was reacting to them, the 10. Below, Mason closed his eyes for one long second. Then he opened them and stepped forward. One step. The entire block gasped. Reeves shouted, "Mason, stop." But Mason kept walking. A second step. A third. Heading straight toward the opening in the sealed wing door. Reeves turned to the warden. "Sir, we have to do something." Hale finally spoke through clenched teeth. "Reeves, if Mason goes inside that wing, we lose him." Reeves grabbed his radio. "Then we stop him." "Reeves," Hale snapped. "Listen to me. If you move toward him, the others will react. You saw what they can do when they follow each other. But we can't just." A sudden bang cut him off. This time it wasn't from the sealed wing. It came from the far end of the block. A cell door snapped open, not flung, not jammed, released. A single inmate stepped out. His chest and arms were inked with sharp black geometric tattoos that climbed toward his shoulders in patterns that looked like broken glass. Carter Pike whispered, "Oh no, not him." Reeves turned sharply. "Who is that?" Calvin answered quietly. "Number 5. Reeves felt the blood drain from his face. 2 of the 10 were now free, and Mason was walking straight into the sealed wing. The alarms kept echoing through Folsom as guards swept the tiers, searching for 2 missing men, Razor and Boone. Their escape attempt inside the laundry room had triggered a full facility lockdown, and the entire block felt like it was holding its breath. People whispered, faces pressed to the bars, waiting for word. No one knew if the 2 most unpredictable men in the prison were still inside or already out. The yard stayed empty. The dining hall stayed silent. And on the upper tier, Camilo Reyes stood still, watching the red emergency lights blink against the walls like warning pulses. He knew Razor wasn't the type to run blindly. Razor always carried a plan, even when the plan was dangerous enough to scare everyone else. Hours passed before the discovery came. Razor and Boone hadn't escaped at all. They were hiding inside a maintenance crawl space between 2 old storage rooms, a space so narrow the air was dusty and stale. A team of officers dragged them out one by one, covered in dust, muttering quietly. No struggle, no outburst, just the tension of 2 men whose last gamble had failed. When the doors slammed shut behind them, the prison seemed to settle back into its normal rhythm. But normal at Folsom never really meant calm. It meant a slow build toward the next explosion. Weeks later, the yard reopened, but the tension stayed. New rules were enforced, tighter movement schedules, more checks, more pressure. And that pressure focused even harder on the inmates California wished people would forget. Silas Cooper, the former firefighter turned inmate, felt it the most. His quiet reputation had changed after the laundry incident. Even though he took no part in it, guards now watched him like he was a fuse waiting to burn. Others on the yard approached him carefully. Some whispered that he had protected too many people during the lockdown. Some said he was trying to change the balance of power. One afternoon, as the sun hit the concrete yard and the distant sound of radios buzzed overhead, Silas sat on a bench alone. A fresh tattoo on his forearm, a simple black line forming a mountain peak, peeked out from his sleeve. He'd gotten it to remind himself of who he wanted to be, not who this place kept trying to turn him into. But not everyone respected that quiet. Tank approached him with 3 men behind him. His heavy tattooed arms flexed as he locked eyes with Silas. The yard thinned out instantly. People knew trouble when they saw the pattern, a group moving with intent, and everyone else stepping aside. Tank stopped in front of Silas. "You've been walking around like you run things now," Tank said, his voice low, but carrying enough weight to shift the air around them. Silas stayed seated, hands on his knees. "I don't run anything," he said. "I just stay out the way." "Out the way," Tank repeated, a smile forming with no warmth behind it. "Nobody stays out the way in here." A guard on the tower called down to break it up. Tank didn't move. The guard repeated himself. Still nothing. The whole yard felt like a lit fuse, ready, waiting, burning toward the moment neither man wanted. Finally, Silas stood up, slow and steady. Not to confront, not to challenge, just so the yard didn't explode on top of him while he was sitting down. "You want something from me?" Silas asked quietly. Tank's jaw tightened. For the first time in his life, maybe, the guilt of what brought him to Folsom flashed in his eyes. It was a flicker, brief, almost impossible to notice, but Silas saw it. "You're making people forget who the real problems are," Tank said. "And I don't like that." Before anything else could happen, Razor's voice cut through the tension from across the yard. "Tank, leave him." Tank turned, annoyed, ready to snap back, but stopped when he realized who it was. Even separated units and weeks in the hole hadn't weakened Razor's influence. His tattoos were still bold, the one on his neck, an intricate pattern shaped like a broken compass, catching the sunlight. Tank stepped away. His crew followed. Silas exhaled slowly. Razor glanced at him once, then walked off without another word. That moment shifted everything. The balance of power changed. Silas didn't ask for it, didn't want it, but it happened anyway. Razor respected him. Tank didn't want to test him. And the administration kept watching all 3 men with growing concern. They weren't the only dangerous ones in Folsom, but they were the ones who attracted stories, rumors, fear. Prisons hate chaos, but they fear influence even more. A few weeks later, the warden made his move. Silas was called to the administrative wing for what he assumed was a routine check. Instead, he was told he was being transferred, not out of Folsom, but into a new high-control unit designed for inmates whose presence disrupts long-term stability. Silas blinked. I didn't do anything. The officer escorting him shrugged. Sometimes it's not what you did. It's who pays attention when you're around. He walked down the hallway, past peeling paint, past grounded echoes of boots, past a place he had tried to survive quietly. The tattoo on his arm felt heavy with meaning now, a reminder of something bigger than these walls. As they opened the metal door into the new unit, voices echoed from inside. Some calm, some troubled, some full of the kind of energy that makes prison administrators nervous. Among them was Razor, seated on a bunk with his hands clasped. He looked up and smirked. Knew they'd move you here, Razor said. You're one of us now. Silas stepped inside, feeling the weight of that sentence settle on him like a cold shadow. California had tried to forget men like these. Men whose names never made headlines, but whose presence shaped the very structure of the prison system. Men who didn't fit into simple boxes. Not heroes, not villains, but something far more complicated. Silas took a slow breath, realizing he was now a part of that forgotten group, whether he wanted to be or not. And just as the door closed behind him, a distant alarm went off somewhere deep in the prison, one that didn't belong to their unit. Something new had sparked, something no one expected, and whatever it was moving straight toward them. Folsom Prison has held many men, but only a few leave behind shadows that stretch across decades. The stories of Silas, Razor, Tank, Boone, and the others remind us that behind every locked door is a person shaped by choices, pressure, fear, loyalty, and survival. California tried to bury their names, but their actions shaped the culture inside one of America's most notorious prisons. Their legacies still echo through the tears, whispered by guards, remembered by inmates, and studied by anyone trying to understand what truly happens behind concrete walls. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content.